The Terminator is a horror film. Once you strip off the flashy science fiction meta narrative, it's the story of a monster on a killing spree and a brave final girl who is ultimately able to destroy it at terrible cost. None of the following films are really horror films, though most of them borrow the chase structure from the first film. The Sarah Connor Chronicles is explicitly a science fiction, suspense, espionage, and action show, but in interesting and important ways, it hangs on to the horror roots of the first film. It dives deeper into disturbing imagery to emphasize the monstrous nature of the Terminators. It's much less afraid of killing characters than most sci fi action shows, and it has an incredibly bleak outlook, unusual for the often feel good vibes of network television. I definitely wouldn't say that it's an actual horror show, but I think the edge that comes with its understanding of its source material is part of why it still has so many fans today, 16 years after it began. One of the things that I think makes horror so bleak is the tendency of characters to betray each other. Instead of serving as a hopeful or idealized message of the power of connection between people and the importance of human relationships, there's an understanding of the fallen nature of man in Christian terms. In the original film, though Sarah doesn't intend to betray Kyle, she does by calling her mother, who has been killed and impersonated by the monster hunting them. In today's episode, Gnothi Seauton, Greek for Know Thyself, the plot of the episode hinges around a double betrayal, one in the episode and one of the audience. My name is Ian. My co host name is Calvin. Come with us if you want to live. Insert theme song here!
Dun 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 dun.
So, as with all of our episodes, I want to emphasize that this is a spoiler analysis podcast. This is not a advertisement podcast. We assume that you have watched the episode, at least that we're talking about, and probably have a reasonable familiarity with the entire Terminator film series. So, spoilers start now. Now, Calvin, what do you think about the theme of betrayal in this episode, in the show Sarah Connor Chronicles as a whole, and in the Terminator franchise in general?
Uh, well, we will probably talk about this in a future episode, but some of the science fiction that inspired the Terminator franchise is about the fundamental betrayal that the Terminators themselves represent, which is that our own creations, these machines that we've made, have turned on us as humans, and the duplicity, the perfidiousness of the Terminators, that they pretend to be human even though that they're not human, in order to give us a false sense of security, which they use to kill us. Now, the main sort of betrayal in this show is that, in this episode, is that a human actually betrays Sarah, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later when the character of Enrique gets introduced. And I think there's also sort of this show introduces some of its religious and philosophical and maybe slightly political themes, which I think also maybe relate to the question of the nature of betrayal.
Yeah, something I was thinking about is this show. I mean, I've already rewatched it in preparation for this podcast, but I've also been rewatching the episodes before we start each episode. Is that there's a lot more explicit religious assumptions and language than you get today. Today, there's an extremely determined secularity to almost all TV and movies that I see. And it was kind of refreshing to see a show from 16 years ago that doesn't have that layer of effort. I definitely wouldn't say that the Sarah Connor Chronicles or the Terminator franchise as a whole is a Christian series, but it is deeply imbued with Christian symbolism and language.
Do you think that's because, I mean, maybe this is a cynical way of framing it, but do you think that's in part because of the 4 major broadcast networks at the time, Fox is the one that maybe competing with ABC a little bit before Disney bought ABC, but Fox is the network that most self-consciously marketed itself to sort of red state sensibilities?
No, because the 3 showrunners, especially Josh Friedman, hated working with Fox. So I'm pretty sure he had no interest in dealing with Fox as an entity or their philosophical or political or audience appeal. I think it's honestly, I think it's just inherent to the material because, I think Cameron and Hurd, when they were creating the first one, named the future savior of humanity, John Connor, with those initials JC. And I know it may seem perhaps facile to say they have the same initials as Jesus Christ, but I do think that's actually an important thing that people are playing with throughout all of the Terminator um, stories that have been told about John Connor.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not facile to say that it's obviously something. I mean, I think Cameron has come out and said that that was intentional on his part,
Right.
and I mean, it's been used in other places as well. I mean, Stephen King named the character that's the center of the novel that eventually became a movie, The Green Mile, John Coffey, and there's also Christ themes in that story as well. In fact, the main prison warden, who's played by Tom Hanks in the movie, is explicitly sort of an apostle-like figure who's supposed to be telling John Coffey's story.
Well, before we even get into the episode, there's something that people may or may not be aware of, which is that the a key bit of detail is hidden in the previously on segment.
I
Cromartie,
wanted to talk about the previously on segment.
yeah. Oh, go
Is
ahead.
that okay if we do that? Okay, because we spent maybe too much time last episode talking about the significance of the fact that the pilot starts with a cold open, and in this episode, the second episode, we get a previously on segment, which is not a trope from 1999 era television, but is very much a trope of 2007 2008 television, which is that there's been this transition from having distinct sort of mystery of the week episodes to having a more serialized narrative format for series. And so something that was not that common in the 90s or before is now very common, in fact universal on television, which is that you have to have a previously on segment in order to remind viewers of what the continuing story is.
Indeed. And something that I've actually seen in a couple different shows is, for some reason, when editing the episodes, they cut out important bits of information or event that are then shown in the previously on. And in this case, that is, Cromartie's head came through the bank, through the time bubble, and bounced onto the side of the road. So it came
Yes,
with...
which is a clear violation of the rules of how time travel works.
Well, the rules as far as time travel works in the first movie alone, because the second movie, remember, has the liquid metal Terminator coming through the time bubble, as does the third movie, and the fifth movie, and the sixth movie, and then the fourth movie doesn't have time travel. So everything except the first movie has broken that rule with the liquid metal Terminators. Now, the novelization of the second movie claims that there's a flesh capsule that the Terminator 1000 comes through the bubble with, but everything
which is a
ignores
classic novelization trope, which is that whatever professional science fiction writer they hired to do the novelization feels compelled to retcon the mistakes of the sloppy movie writing in order to make it more consistent. Like that happens. I mean, you've probably read more novelizations than I have because you're a big Star Wars Extended Universe fan. But like, that seems like a classic science fiction novelization trope, is the science fiction writer fixing the mistakes of the movie.
Oh yes, it very much is. I will say, even if we don't accept, so Josh Friedman, the writer of this episode and showrunner and creator of the show, says that Cromartie's head is covered in flesh and it burns off as it goes through the time bubble.
No,
that's silly because that still
that is not what we see. That is not what we see on the screen.
But the other thing is,
we clearly see a fully chrome head pop. It's almost like the stereotypical like 3D like right at you.
Which might
it's
be
clearly
why
meant to be a jump scare of some kind. It's meant to look cool, but it's a silly, violation of the rules. So how do you feel about that? Because
first I want to say that Sarah has a gunshot wound with stitching, and Cameron has open wounds that are healing over her endoskeleton as they go through. So we already broke the rules of time travel. So I'm just going to kind of ignore that.
Arguably, the rule from the first movie is a rule that Cameron created to justify the visual of Arnold Schwarzenegger not wearing clothes.
Well, and that they don't have futuristic weaponry in the present.
Right.
Like, that's a big thing.
So obviously to a certain extent, the rule that's established in the first movie is an example of hand waving.
Oh yes, it's very silly.
So can you do we feel upset about the breaking of an arbitrary rule?
No, because the only movie that's tried to do something like that is Terminator Genisys, the fifth movie. They say that, if you go through with clothes, it's like sticking a fork in a microwave. But then they still don't explain how the T-1000 goes through. So
right,
nobody's consistent with it. So I'm not really bothered. It's part of the fantasy rules. I mean, there is a science fantasy element of Terminator, even though it has the rivets aesthetic that Orson Scott Card says makes science fiction instead of fantasy.
I mean, there are literally lots of rivets in this show.
Robots are made of rivets. Yes,
they are. Well, in a future, is it next episode? We'll learn how robots are made. Is it the next episode or the episode after that?
I mean, lots of the episodes. This whole arc is basically Cromartie rebuilding himself, so I think it's the next several episodes.
We'll circle back to how robots are made. I think all genre fiction kind of rests on this idea of the tension between suspense and surprise. And one way that science fiction and rules-based fantasy magic deals with that is that it establishes rules for how the technology or magic works, but then sometimes it breaks the rules in order to surprise the reader. So
Right.
I'm okay with the occasional surprise breaking of previously established rules in science fiction, so long as it doesn't undermine the underlying suspension of disbelief for us as an audience.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of, like, when I was a kid, I used to read the library had a copy of it was called the Nitpicker's Guide to Science Fiction to Star Trek, in which, like, some nerd wrote this book that, like, pointed out all of the, like, plot holes and mistakes in each individual episode of Star Trek. And, like, halfway through the book, I'm like, this is not a fun book. Like, who cares? Like, I don't care that, like, oh, in this episode, they said transporters use, 2 million watts of electricity, and in this episode they said they use 3 million watts of electricity. I was like, who cares? It's a transporter. Like,
It's taking people apart and putting them back together. If you are really anal about the amount of watts needed to do that, then you're watching the wrong show.
yes, exactly.
Yeah. I am not bothered.
Go watch Trains or something.
Yeah, I'm not. Or what's the time travel movie that's like super realistic?
None. No.
Primer.
No
Primer.
time travel.
No.
No time travel movies are super realistic.
Shane Carruth's Primer is the one that's super realistic and also incredibly boring.
I think Primer is a great movie. I'm not sure that it's realistic so much as it's
confusing.
Yeah, it's it does establish clear rules. The rules don't make any more sense than any other time travel story, but it does establish clear rules and kind of follows through on them to unexpected. What's interesting about Primer, I did not expect to talk about Primer.
Time travel thing.
What's interesting about Primer is that it's a time travel story that establishes clear rules for how time travel works at the beginning, which are different from how time travel works in most movies. And so a lot of the great surprises in that movie come from how it breaks time travel movie tropes by following the rules that it established at the beginning. It's an interesting movie, I think. You thought it was boring.
I mean, it's definitely interesting. It just didn't hold my interest. But let's
very Looper, in which, like,
that's a very silly movie.
In which the younger version of Bruce Willis says, like, so how does time travel work? And Bruce Willis is like, I'm not even going to tell you how time travel works. It just does. Damn it.
The one thing I will say that kind of bugs me in terms of suspension of disbelief is Sarah was shot 4 days ago and she's acting like everything is fine. And
again, this is TV.
I know, but it happens a lot in this show. Like, count how many times they get shot and then next week they're just fine.
My grandpa, I'll say one thing and then I'll say another thing. So my grandpa and I watch the show Gunsmoke, which is, I think, still, although Simpsons and Law and Order came close, it is still the longest running television show in the history of television. Like, there are like 500 episodes of Gunsmoke, and over the course of Gunsmoke, which lasted for like 20 years, Marshall Dillon, the main character, gets shot like 150 times.
He's
like,
more lead
in real life, Marshall Dillon would be dead, like,
of lead poisoning,
and not, like, able to live on and make made-for-TV movies during the 80s. So So the gunshot wounds do not work the same way on television, and it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll talk about. I'll bring this back up when we get more into the plot of the episode. But I have another thought on that.
Okay. Well, we have next Sarah's opening monologue, which introduces the title of the episode, Know Thyself, in Greek. And this is a pretty big theme for a
Gnothi
science fiction show
Seauton.
about robots.
Yeah. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was leaving space because this is your point.
Oh. Oh, you wanted me to say the things that I wrote down?
Yes.
Okay. I had switched back to video, so I was no longer reading the notes. So I apologize. Yeah. So I think that the fundamental nature of literature is all literary texts ask the question, who am I? Whoever the narrator is, whoever the main characters are, the question is always, who am I? In science fiction, what's unique to the science fiction genre is the way that question is often posed is in the form of the question, what is a human? So a lot of science fiction, classic science fiction stories deal with the question, what is a human? As does the Terminator franchise and this show in particular. And I think this show in particular, and this is maybe why I like it so much, asks that question in a more thoughtful way than any of the other installments in the Terminator franchise. What is a human?
Yeah, I mean, they explicitly show characters who are biologically human, like Sarah and Derek, and even John at times, who seem to act in machine calculating ways, and they show machines that seem to be trying to act in human ways. And so it really blurs those lines and makes you question, what is it that we can define as human, and can a human not be a human? Like these interesting identity and moral questions.
Yeah, and so a lot of this episode is Sarah Connor asking herself, who is Sarah Connor? Or am I Sarah Connor?
And that question will remain to the very end of the series.
Yes.
Now, as part of the plot of the week for this show, we have the character of Enrique, who's a Guatemalan, seems like paramilitary / gang person, who we first saw in the Terminator 2 film, played by Castulo Guerra, and he's played here in the Terminator Sarah Connor Chronicles by Tony Amendola, which goes with Josh Friedman's stated policy of never using any actors from the previous films because he wants this to be its own universe and not have people distracted by casting. And we can debate the merits on whether that's a good idea or not, but I think it's worthwhile to note that all the characters, even if they appear in other Terminator films, are actually their own actors.
Yeah, I mean, last episode we talked about some of the continuity and discontinuity between Lena Headey and Linda Hamilton, and their portrayals of Sarah Connor. Yeah, I think overall it's a good choice for them to not. I mean, they make constant sort of. There's a lot of choices in the writing of this show that make constant callbacks to the previous films. I think it's an overall good choice for them to not try to replicate casting. It's interesting, you know. Well, in the first scene with Enrique, it's not really addressed, and the scene with Charlie Dixon, the Dean Winters character, it's not addressed in a way that's almost comical. The fact that Sarah Connor and John Connor have not aged at all in 7 years, and none of the characters that they know from before make explicit comment on this.
They will later in the show. So that is an explicit plot point later in the show, but right now they're kind of ignoring that.
Yeah, I mean, you wanted to talk about the theme of betrayal, which I agree is an interesting idea. Yeah, there's Sarah Connor is not in the third movie, which maybe we can talk about later when we talk about the revelation that Cameron gives to Sarah Connor at the midway point in the plot structure of the show. There's a big time gap from the last time that we saw Sarah Connor at the end of T2, and then there's also a time gap between the first and the second movie. And so part of what the Enrique character is doing in this episode is it's kind of filling us in order to answer that question, who is Sarah Connor, we kind of are being filled in on the question of like, what has Sarah Connor been doing for the past 17 years of her life? And part of what she was doing is being some sort of paramilitary guerrilla fighter in the jungles of South America.
Well, training. I don't think she was probably a fighter because of something we learn at the end of the episode. There's something, I think, I can't remember if we talked about it last episode. Did I talk about the fact that they changed the timeline of Terminator 2 last episode?
We did. We talked about that.
Okay, never mind. I've already done it then.
So I said 17 years because I think that's how old John is supposed to be at the beginning of this
I think
series.
he's 16 and turned 17 at the end of the season.
Although
it's possible he's 15 and turned 16. We'll have to see when we get to the finale.
Yes, we will check back in on that bit of fact checking. But yes, obviously the shift in the timeline means that she was not training in Guatemala during the early 90s, but late 80s, early 90s, which would be an interesting time to be training in Guatemala. But has apparently been training in Guatemala during the mid to late 90s, which is a slightly less interesting time to be training in Guatemala in the post NAFTA era of U.S. Latin American relations.
So Cameron gives us a big piece of information that is a logical follow-on from the fact that there was a resistance fighter who was sent back to build the bank, the time machine, and the future weapon that we saw in the pilot. But there are apparently resistance fighters popping up all over the timeline right now, as well as Terminators popping up all over the timeline right now. So do you feel this makes the plot element of time travel? Does this excitement, because it is very exciting to think you're like Skynet and John Connor are basically chess players sending back their pawns and bishops and knights throughout the timeline trying to make moves to defeat each other. So that's very exciting. But it's also, it stretches the disbelief of time travel and changing the past and the future a lot. So do you think the benefit of the excitement outweighs the stretching of disbelief or not?
Well, the fifth movie, Terminator Genesis, posits one explanation for how John Connor is able to play three-dimensional chess with Skynet.
We'll get
This
to this.
show, yeah, this show, especially in the second season, poses, I think, maybe a slightly different solution to that problem.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that when we get to This Is the Day. Today is the Day parts 1 and 2, which is one of my favorite episodes. And the writer of that episode, Zach Stens, I think articulates it really well when he says that Josh Friedman's answer to how does John Connor beat Skynet is he was basically raised close to machines, so he knows how they work and how they think, and so he can outthink Skynet because of that familiarity.
Yeah, I mean this episode, and I was going to bring this up maybe a little later, but I'll bring it up now. This episode, John's not in this episode a lot. I mean, he has a
No.
few significant scenes, but this episode is mostly the Sarah Cameron show,
which is a good show.
Which is interesting because the theme of the show is Sarah Connor asking herself the question, who am I? Who is Sarah Connor? But it's also, we get a little bit into Cameron asking the question, who is Cameron? And Cameron is clearly a Terminator. She's clearly a robot, cyborg, whatever word you want to use. I use them interchangeably. Nerds be damned. But the sort of the contrast between Sarah and the interaction between Sarah and Cameron kind of drives this episode.
Well, as I said, the question of who Sarah is, the question of who Cameron is, the question of who John Connor is, drive the entire show. These will continue to be asked and definitely don't get an answer here. And I would argue possibly don't even get an answer all the way through the show, which I think is a statement about the fluid nature of growth and reaction to extreme trauma that all the characters are going through.
Yeah, I mean, Ian, are you there?
Yeah, you froze for a sec.
You disappeared completely.
Connection issues.
Yes, connection issues, just like the main characters of this show. What we were saying. Yeah, no, I mean, you were talking about the fluid nature of trying to solve the question, who am I? And again, we'll get into this much later in our discussions, but you could say, if you had just watched the first two movies, you could say that one of the advantages that humanity has over Skynet is that humans grow and change, whereas Skynet kind of just keeps doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But this show posits the possibility that maybe Skynet can grow too.
Or pieces of Skynet.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons I love the show. So we next have a Terminator versus Terminator fight. We don't actually learn the designation of this Terminator till later, but we see here the direction by David Nutter, who also directed the pilot, serves as a executive producer because of that, and directed the first episode of season 2. It's interesting that he directs both the pilot and this first episode of season 1, because it really solidifies the visual style of the show, which is something that pilot directors almost always do. They develop a visual language and visual signifiers that all the directors afterwards try to match.
Yeah, I mean, I distinctly remember when I was first watching the show on television and talking about it with friends in college, that the fight scenes really impressed a lot of the fans that I talked to when I was in college.
I don't know if I was a little disappointed, because I came to Terminator Sarah Connor Chronicles basically because I liked Summer Glau, and I kind of liked Terminator. But Summer Glau in Firefly was very balletic, and the action scenes were extremely choreographed. But that, of course, takes tons of time and rehearsal, which a TV show is not going to have. So most of these fight scenes are Terminators picking each other up and throwing each other at things.
Yes. Which, again, part of the, and maybe this is the time to introduce it, part of this episode introduces the fact that that Cameron as a character and Summer Glau as a performer are funny, which I know is not your favorite topic because you don't like humor, but I feel like it's necessary to talk about in this episode. Cameron is unintentionally funny in this episode, throughout the episode. She says funny things, but I think there's also a kind of physical comedy to the fact that in real life, Summer Glau would not be able to destroy, a 250-pound, muscle dude. But because both of them are Terminators, the premise of Cameron's character is that she is in fact able to do this, which is physically funny in the same way that especially in more recent Tom Cruise movies, like the Jack Reacher movie and some of the newer Mission Impossible movies, a lot of the humor in those movies is derived from Tom Cruise's sort of late career acknowledgement that he is not a huge dude, and they have sort of this Buster Keaton, Jackie Chan quality to a lot of the fights in the newer Tom Cruise movies. And one of my favorites is the fight between him and Superman. What's his name?
Mustache Superman.
Yes, Mustache Superman.
Henry Cavill.
Henry Cavill, thank you. Between him and Henry Cavill in the bathroom, the French bathroom. I guess that was 3 Mission Impossibles ago. Or 2 Mission Impossibles ago. Anyway, it's a great scene of Tom Cruise fighting a much larger opponent. But yeah, no, I think yes, you're correct that Cameron does not have quite the same fighting style as River Tam, but I think that they're interesting fight scenes.
After the fight scene, Sarah and Cameron head home, and Sarah's very upset because she doesn't understand why Cameron...
Naively, perhaps.
doesn't understand why Cameron knows all this stuff and isn't telling her everything. And Cameron immediately tells her something that explains, at least to us, the audience, why she doesn't tell Sarah everything, because she can't handle it. and that is that Sarah, if she had remained in 1999, would have died in 2005 from cancer, which is, I think, directly a reference to Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, in which Sarah Connor dies of cancer just after Judgment Day was supposed to happen. She held on to make sure that they had stopped it. What do you think about this borrowing of a plot point from Terminator 3 for the Sarah Connor Chronicles?
I think, well, we talked about this when you were talking about the show creator wanting to sort of make the show its own thing that wasn't entirely dependent on the movies. So I think both you and I like the third movie, but yeah, the premise of this show is that the third movie takes place in an alternate timeline that does not exist in this show.
Well, it has to, because Terminator 3 has Judgment Day in 2003, and
Yeah.
Sarah Connor Chronicles has Judgment Day in 2011.
Yes. Which is, good for us.
Yes.
And by us, I mean humanity.
So we learn that all these resistance fighters and the Terminators that they're sent to the same times have different missions than the Terminators in the movies, which are kill John Connor. So these ones have their own goals and own programming, which will play out in very fun ways throughout the rest of the series.
Yes, and so it's a again, we talked a lot about rules last episode when we talked about the 120-second brain reset if a Terminator gets electrocuted, which happens again in this episide. So
Yep.
nice continuity.
Reinforces the concept for audiences who may not have seen the pilot.
Again and again, physical humor, where Sarah Connor shoves the unconscious Cameron out a window.
And she's fine because she's a robot.
And she's fine because she's a robot, despite John Connor seeming worried. Which I think is touching on John's part, that he was worried that Cameron might, hurt herself by slamming into a car. Yeah, so we get another rule that this show intends to follow, which is that Terminators don't automatically target Sarah and John. It's kind of like the Borg in Star Trek: The Next Generation. They kind of have a mission to do, and if you don't get in their way, they don't get in your way, because they're programmed. Which circles back to kind of what we were talking about with Enrique, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the dialogue between Sarah and Enrique in that first scene, because it brings out some of the themes that I think are in this show. The idea that Enrique says that he sort of lived his life the way that he wanted to, in freedom, that he chose when to end his career rather than letting other people choose it for him, that he was never enslaved or a prisoner. This is, of course, contrasted with the resistance fighters who have tattoos from being in human concentration camps, human work camps in the future. And so you have this idea that part of what it means to be human in the Terminator franchise universe is it means the ability to be free and to not be programmed by a machine.
Or constrained by fate, which John increasingly feels throughout the series.
Correct. And then, again, going back to what you were saying at the very beginning about religious language, there's this exchange where Enrique says that his nephew is not a believer, and Sarah says there are very few of us left. What do you think Enrique and Sarah mean by using the language of believer? Believer in what? Because presumably Enrique does not know that robots from the future are going to destroy humanity.
Probably not. I am not sure. This comes up much more heavily in the first episode of season 2, but Sarah's closing monologue mentions the bodies that God gave us, an explicit idea that we are created and not random, that there is a force of purpose behind us. So I am not sure, but I think that Enrique definitely has an element of idealism to him, or Enrique purports to have an element of idealism to him, contrasted with his nephew, who's all about money and cynicism.
Yeah, so I'm going to propose something. I think there is definitely religious themes to that language, and we'll talk maybe more about that when we come to an episode that deals more with Ellison's character. But I think that, and maybe this is just my bias as an interpreter of texts, but I think that there's a political element to that. Like I said, or I alluded to, with the idea that Guatemala in the late 80s, early 90s is very different from Guatemala post Clinton administration. I think there's this idea that Sarah is literally fighting against the machines in a literal sense, because she knows that Skynet is going to exist at some point. But that Enrique is fighting against the machine of the sort of Western capitalist system, as a presumably anarcho-socialist or communist guerrilla fighter.
I think that may be true. I think so much of what Enrique says is hard to judge in terms of what the show is saying, because Enrique, I'm just going to spoil it here, Enrique is a liar and a traitor. So everything he says may or may not be true.
Well, and I think that's important to establish at the beginning, because I think part of what we find in the betrayal at the end is that Enrique is not merely disloyal to Sarah or to John. He's disloyal to the cause that Sarah and John represent. He's narrowly focused on his own self-interest rather than on what would benefit Sarah's cause and the survival of humanity as a whole.
Perhaps ironically, given his purported opposition to the Western capitalist individualism.
Yes, well, that's what I'm saying. He's a rat because he sells out to the man.
Yeah,
as represented by the FBI.
And I say this as someone who is absolutely no sympathy or friendship to anarcho-socialism, but
yeah, we'll continue with that idea in a little bit later. We get a different. I think we get a. And again, maybe this might seem like a minor point, but we get a different sort of understanding of what it means to be a believer in the scene where right after the Terminator that was sent for the resistance fighters decides to evade Cameron. We have Sarah stealing some random dude's motorcycle. And I think this points to one of the interesting things, and this is definitely part of the horror element in the first movie, and in the second, and I think to a certain extent in all iterations of the Terminator franchise, is this idea that like Sarah and John and Cameron exist in a different reality than the rest of humanity. And so from Sarah's perspective, what she's doing is perfectly rational, because she's trying to save the world. But normie dude with his cell phone on his bicycle, on his motorbike, she's a crazy lady waving a gun around. And so I think you have this contrast throughout this series that everything Sarah and John do seems rational from their perspective, but from an outsider perspective that do not know that Judgment Day is coming, what they're doing seems completely insane and irrational.
Yeah, we then get a little piece of John disobeying his mother, betraying his mother, although I would say it's fairly minor betrayal, but he goes to an internet cafe and discovers the internet, which was definitely not anywhere close to the kind of thing it was in 1999 that it is in 2008.
It was less accessible to the average consumer in 1999 than it was in 2007.
And significantly less powerful.
Yes, significantly less powerful. Yes, we're given a generically named browser search tool. And I'm trying to think, is this introduced at the beginning of the episode or later in the episode? Everyone has flip phones, which I looked it up. The iPhone came out in summer of 2007. So they existed when this show was first broadcast, but they had not, iPhones and other smartphones had not completely taken over the market. So everyone, at least in this episode, has a flip phone, a dumb phone, as we would say now.
Flip phones were the cool hotness back then, though.
Yes, they're so tiny. They're smaller than a human hand. they fit very conveniently in small blue jean pockets of teenagers. Yeah,
especially teenage girls. We also have a hint of the Cromartie plot continuing with the glowing eyes of the skull next to the cat of the construction worker who finds the skull on the side of the road.
Yes.
As Cameron and Sarah approach Enrique's nephew, a gang and illegal substances and illegal weapons dealer, we get there's a bunch of information that's important for the series going forward, and one of them is this character named or called Chola. I don't know if she's ever credited that, but if you ever watch the commentaries, the creators all call her Chola.
I was gonna mention that. I was gonna, I'm a very white dude. You are not white, at least according to some people, but you are from the Midwest. I was going to ask the question: is Chola a racial epithet? I looked it up on the internet. I looked it up on the internet. There is some disagreement as to whether it seems like it's kind of in the same territory as the word queer, in that, like, some people own it as a badge of honor to be referred to as a Chola, and some people view it as being a racial slur. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. Later on, I'm going to call her Front Porch Girl. I'm more comfortable calling her Front Porch Girl than the C word. Later we see Front Porch Girl doing Cameron up in makeup that would be stereotypical for that ethnic designation. This very sort of overly done almost camp feminine makeup.
We also get an important note that people who watch the original Terminator remember, which is that dogs hate Terminator. So the dogs of the gang hate Cameron. And remember, every time you hear dogs, it is a signal that bad robots are coming. It's a very
Yes. Well,
useful.
apparently cats also hate Terminators.
But cats don't bark, so they're not as useful a audible signal.
And Cameron actually lampshades this in the scene where we return to the resistant fighter layer, and they're looking for the safe with the diamonds, which is hidden behind a poster, the famous hang in there poster of a kitten clinging to the limb of a tree. And Cameron says, humans like small animals. She states this matter of factly, but I think it's intended to be humorous.
It's a very important note for the end of season 2. So all of these are really long-reaching pieces that go throughout the show.
It's a well-written show. It's a well-written show. It has complexity. It has depth.
And it gets you to invest. So a lot of shows can have complexity and depth, but it gets you to care about these characters in a way that the complexity matters.
It sets things up. It pays them off. Chekhov's
robots
everywhere. Yes.
Now we get to a really big political and historical element, which is they jumped from 1999 to 2007, and that means they missed 9/11. And so Sarah finds out about 9/11 from these gang members and has basically kind of a blue screen of death moment. She just kind of stares at the screen trying to figure out what this means.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is the most significant historical event that happened in between 1999 and 2007. I don't think anybody's going to argue that. I think it's interesting the way that it frames it. So there's kind of the shock element of it, that the Terminator franchise series deals with a fictional end of the world apocalypse in which most of humanity is wiped out by nuclear war, whereas the event, the 9/11 attack represents a much smaller scale. So Sarah Connor contrasts the idea of 3 billion people being wiped out versus 3,000 people being wiped out. And it also, I think, she has this odd phrase, if I had been there and saw that, I would have thought, we have failed. What do you think she means by that?
I think it's a reference to whether she would feel that saving humanity, like her whole purpose in life in protecting John, is worthwhile if humanity's just going to fly planes into buildings with civilians on them.
Oh, again, you're not taking the bait, Ian. See, I think that it is. I think it's calling back to the conversation with her and Enrique about what it means to be a true believer. I think that part of what it means we failed is this idea that the period of time between 2001 and 2008 seemed like a period of failure for the American political left, in which nothing that they thought was important was honored, and lots of things that they don't like happened. And
I'm sure the people who wrote the show feel that way because they're Hollywood writers, but I don't think the show really holds up as that.
Not to get too political on this podcast, but I think the events of the past few weeks in the news demonstrate that there is a lot of for a while there leftist writers wanted to talk about rural or conservative white rage. There's a lot of leftist rage that kind of got pent up during the Bush years. And this show is explicitly about a band of guerrilla fighters fighting against a system of oppression that they don't like.
I mean, as I said, they're Hollywood writers.
And framing it in the terms of, I mean, in the fictional universe, they are literally saving humanity from destruction.
I have a difficult time equating the Bush presidency with Skynet. And part of that's because, I'm a conservative and a neocon, and so it does not work for me. But I also don't think that the writers made Skynet particularly bushy.
We'll come back to whether Skynet is bushy or not when the character of Catherine Weaver gets introduced much later.
Well, that's a very complicated question.
We'll put a pin in that, Ian. We'll put.
I don't know. You say I'm not taking the bait. I'm genuinely kind of like, when you're saying these things. I'm just like,
right.
Robots and humans, we're fighting, right?
I mean, I agree that if robots like the Terminators were real, they would pose a much greater threat to humanity than any of our current political woes.
Meanwhile, John visits Charlie, and as you mentioned, Charlie does seem a little taken aback by the fact that John is exactly the same age. But it's not
It's a callback to Peter Pan, man. He's the boy that didn't grow up. If the timeline of this show held true, he would be 20, 22, maybe 21.
No, he'd be closer to 24, 25.
But he is still 17, which would be profoundly disturbing, especially if you were sort of the responsible father-like figure like Charlie Dixon.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Peter Pan because John's whole arc is about him having to grow up way too fast, and he really doesn't want to. And like I said, he feels constrained by fate to become the leader. And I think that this show does the best job with John Connor, partly because a lot of other of the movies just don't care about John Connor or dislike John Connor, and so they're very, very weak in how they write him. And this show is very strong. So I think it's nice to have that thematic resonance of Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up, and John, who doesn't want to have to grow up, but will. And there's that real poignant tragedy of that contrast.
Well, and I'm a big fan of Peter Pan. I'll state that right now. In the novel and the original play, Peter Pan. Maybe this is more the novelization of the play than in the play itself. But Peter Pan does not physically grow up, but Peter Pan does quite grown up things. He routinely murders pirates for fun in the novel version of the story. In this, thankfully, because Charlie's one of my favorite characters, John Connor does not murder Charlie. He does shove him to the ground and apparently give him a sizable bruise on his shoulder, which is the most violent thing that we've seen John Connor do up until this point, I think. So whether that's indicative of potential for being a savior of humanity, whether it's just an angry teenager, I don't know. Angry and scared. He acts more scared in that scene, which maybe again this and the internet cafe scene are really the only two significant scenes we get with John. But it's also that scene with him and Charlie, maybe in an understated way, less explicit way than the Sarah Connor scenes in this episode, is John asking himself, "Who am I?" and being confronted with the perspective that Charlie would have on his current situation in a way that frightens him.
Yeah. Our characters then return to the resistance fighters at night, and they find a safe. The resistance fighters were smart enough to wire the safe with a ton of power, which knocks Cameron out when she tries to literally yank it out of the wall. So we get another repetition of the rule of 120 seconds when you shock a Terminator with enough power. We also get a hugely important practical or logistical element, which is that the resistance fighters have managed to amass a sizable fortune in both cash and diamonds. And this becomes...
Diamonds! How did they get the diamonds? Did the diamonds come from the future? How did they get the diamonds, Ian?
I mean, maybe they ate the diamonds and pooped them out. I don't know.
Yeah, but where did they get the diamonds in the future?
It was a jewelry store in bombed out LA, obviously.
Okay. Well, we'll get more information on how the resistance is going in future episodes, because the stinger for this scene is that there is a resistance fighter who is still alive.
Yep, it has that tattoo that we saw on Kyle Reese in the first movie. Skynet Work Camp, which I've always struggled with. What the robots want to kill humans, why are they keeping them in camps?
But it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any more sense than the cat people enslaving humanity in Battlefield Earth, or any other science fiction story in which supposedly far advanced, technologically advanced entities enslave humanity to do their bidding. Like, what would be the point? The thing that makes the most sense is War of the Worlds, in which H.G. Wells' aliens, Martians, just like eat humans for food. Like, that would make the most sense. No other iterations on the enslaving humanity trope makes sense. Why, again, like 1990, call back to 1999, like, why does the Matrix use humans for supposedly like bioelectric batteries? Like, that makes no sense. Like, enslaving humanity makes no sense
for a non-human race, which is so technologically or physically advanced that they can just squish us.
Yes.
We finally get our new IDs from Enrique's nephew, and John and Cameron go through John's new backstory as John Baum, which I believe remains his alias through the end of the series.
Well, the idea is that is it Carlos is Enrico's nephew? The idea is that Carlos has crafted such foolproof IDs that they will last them for a long time, and that's why they cost $20,000.
Yeah. And John has a very poignant sentence: "My dad is always a hero, and he's always dead." And I think that's a statement on how Sarah has really drilled into Kyle's head and heart. John's head and heart about Kyle, who she sees him as, and who she wants her son to see him as, and John's just hunger for a dad because his dad was dead before he was even born. And we see that hunger and why he seeks out Charlie and how he relates to Charlie as he goes forward. And of course, there's the Terminator 2. Arnold is John's father figure for 2 days.
Right, which James Cameron said that the Terminator in Terminator 2 is the perfect father figure, which just further indicates to me that James Cameron has porridge for brains. But
he's really good at making actions, but in terms of
he's very good at making things explode.
But in terms of understanding humans on a deeper level than high school, not so much.
Game over, man. Game over.
Now,
I don't know why I put this in. No, wait. First, I wanted to to continue the Cromartie plot. The body reunites with its head, which is fun.
I mean, it's creepy and very horror-y.
Humor thing. It is gory. It's also fun in the sort of gallows humor that the franchise has played with since the very first movie.
I'm not 100% sure I buy that the body of a Terminator can walk around without.
It's got some sort of cybernetic brainstem. It's like a chicken.
Okay. It makes
which
a lot of
maybe breaks the rules for how the Terminator gets destroyed in the first movie, because it seems like once the head is destroyed, it's done for in the first movie. But as is often the case with monsters, once you get the monster's head, the monster is dead. I think it's fun that the guy who the Terminator kills is watching television, and he's watching a commercial for a DVD player that costs $19.99. Of course, in 1999, the year that Sarah and John have come from, DVD players cost $1,000. I looked this up. If you wanted to buy a DVD player in 1999, it cost $1,000. In 2007, they cost $19.99. And just a few years later, they will have become mostly irrelevant because of the rise of streaming services.
And Blu-ray players are now about $80 or $90.
Yes, so nobody is paying $1,000 for a DVD player. What? Just fun fact, so the audience can get to know us. What was the first DVD that you ever watched?
The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring. I watched it on a friend's laptop player because I wanted to see the special features.
I think maybe I was an earlier adopter of DVDs than you were. The first DVD, we had a Blockbuster video store within walking distance of our house. And the Blockbuster Video started having like its own section, a very small section of DVDs. Most of the store was still VHS, but there was a small section of DVDs. And the first DVD that I ever rented from Blockbuster was Hunt for the Red October. And then I think after that, I got Star Trek Insurrection. Which is the third movie in the Next Generation movie series. And then I got, I forget when did this happen. I foolishly, as many children do, subscribed to the Columbia DVD Club. There was this marketing gimmick thing where they would sell you like 5 DVDs for $5 or something like that, which seemed like a huge bargain back in the late 90s. But then subsequent months, they would just send you a DVD, whether you wanted one or not, and then bill you for it. So it was like this marketing scheme. My parents found out that I had done this, and that it upset them. and they helped me cancel the plan before I spent all of my allowance money on DVDs. But one of the I still have some of the DVDs that I think I bought with the Columbia DVD Club plan. Fun facts. Fun facts.
Having irrevocably displayed our boomerishness to our audience, we move to the final reveal of Enrique's treachery, in which, well, it's not the final
Boomerishness.
reveal, but Sarah and Cameron go back to Enrique after hearing Carlos, his nephew, talk about another nickname for him, which is El Rata. And they confront him, and he denies. He says that he did give the authorities some information on a child kidnapper, but that was it. And Cameron shoots him dead because she thinks he might be a problem.
I mean, Cameron's probably right.
Cameron is absolutely right,
does,
but we don't know that at this time.
This is a callback to. I mean, I think it's a great way to end that scene. I mean, obviously, in real life, I would be concerned for the preservation of human life, but I think even of terrible people. But I think it's a great ending to that scene because, like I said, throughout the scene, it's kind of been the Sarah Cameron show. A lot of their interactions have been based on humor, and kind of the point, the premise of all of the jokes is that Cameron is a robot and therefore doesn't understand human social interactions, human language, and so keeps doing and saying funny things because she doesn't understand. And the ending of the scene where she kills Enrique again demonstrates her non-humanness, and the fact that despite Enrique's betrayal, Sarah feels compassion for Enrique, but Cameron feels no compassion.
This brings up a very interesting structural choice the show has made to give John another Terminator, which is that John and Sarah in the movies never kill any humans. And the show takes this as they never have. And that's very important for their development in the show. But they hang out with Cameron, who kills lots of humans.
Yes, which is different from the Terminator in the second film, who was explicitly ordered by the child John to not kill humans. But we're told in this episode, which I think is an important plot point, that Cameron does not take orders from this John. She takes orders from future John. Which in some ways makes her more deadly, as you just pointed out, but also makes her more of a, again, she's like half Pinocchio, half Jiminy Cricket. She becomes a conscience for of sorts for this John and this Sarah, because she is solely motivated by the goals of future John and what he has programmed her to do.
Well, in this season.
Yes.
This gets intensely complicated in season 2. Do you think that John and Sarah have any complicity or guilt for all the people that Cameron kills?
Do they have actual guilt as opposed to guilt feelings?
Actual guilt.
No, because they have absolutely no control over Cameron or any way of stopping her from doing what she's doing.
Okay.
I mean, I guess, yes, they could destroy Cameron in the way that they've destroyed Terminators in the past. They could somehow electrocute her and then, thermite her into oblivion. But realistically, they have no way of stopping Cameron from doing the things that she does. And so I don't think that they're guilty for the things that she does. What do you think?
I think they do have some guilt because they've explicitly chosen to fight Skynet, which means putting themselves in conflict with the people who are creating Skynet. And they're doing that with Cameron along with them, so they know Cameron is going to do this kind of thing. Maybe they don't know now, but after Cameron kills Enrique, they definitely know that Cameron's going to start killing people if they continue with an aggressive campaign against Skynet and Skynet's creators. So I think that they do have some responsibility for that.
Well, that's an interesting question because they are at war. This kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's always a contrast in scenes that take place in the present day as opposed to the future, that the main characters are soldiers in a war that no one else around them knows is happening. Which kind of goes back to what you were saying about this, in part, being participating in the spy and espionage genre. And so Enrique, by betraying Sarah, becomes an enemy combatant in that war, whether he realizes it or not. And Cameron treats him the way a soldier treats an enemy combatant. She kills him. So from that perspective, not killing Enrique is immoral. I don't know.
Well, it's tricky because, as I said, Sarah and Cameron don't know this, but we see Enrique explicitly betraying them to Ellison by a phone message, which is kind of the only thing Ellison does in this episode. But this betrayal, this explicit betrayal, kind of closes out our episode and the theme that I began us with. And I think that is not just a betrayal of Enrique of Sarah, but it's also somewhat a betrayal of the show, of its audience, because someone who came to the show from Terminator 2 was like, oh, that Guatemalan dude who helped Sarah was super cool. He gave her guns and he had kids and he was like this family dude. And all of a sudden we find out that no, he's actually a rat and he's a liar. And so that's kind of a betrayal of the expectations that Terminator 2 sets up for us. I don't mind, but it is, I would argue it is a betrayal.
A betrayal of us as an audience in that we're being asked to make an act of sacrifice. How is it betraying? In order for somebody to be betraying you, they have to be promising you something and then do the opposite. So what is the show promising us that they go back on by killing the Enrique character?
It's not killing the Enrique character. It is having the Enrique character go from a loyal ally and a positive moral and emotional figure for Sarah in Terminator 2 to being a rat. Pretty despicable, in my opinion, in this episode.
Well, but you started this conversation by talking about how humans change and grow, and that's true. Humans don't always change and grow in morally good directions.
Humans can
Sometimes
corrupt.
sometimes a good person becomes a bad person.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And I'm
Enrique
not
was
saying it's illogical.
within the framework of the second movie, Enrique was a good person. Although, as we've already pointed out, from a more objective political perspective, maybe Enrique is not a good person, even in the second movie, because he's trying to take down his government and institute communism.
Very bad thing, guys.
But within the context of the second film, he's portrayed as being a good person. And then, yeah, by this episode, he has become a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that's just character. That's just a character arc. I don't know that that's a betrayal of us as an audience.
I think it really depends on how much you liked Enrique in the second movie. I didn't really care, partly because of what you're saying is that I disagree with Enrique's purported political ends, so I'm not that attached to him. But I know some fans of the movie are and were quite upset about the way he was used in this episode. So
I mean, I think that it is. If that happened to me, I would be sad that Enrique did that to me. Like if I was Sarah Connor, I would be sad. I don't know that I would necessarily be sad that Cameron kills him because he deserves to die.
I agree. Although, again, Cameron doesn't know that.
Well, Cameron is acting the way that spies often do when they're in enemy territory.
Yes,
which
they
is I
kill the
cannot
most
take a
likely
chance
threat.
on being exposed as a spy, and so I will get rid of anybody who could potentially blow my cover.
Yeah. That brings us to the end of our episode. What are your closing thoughts on Gnothi Seauton, or Know Thyself?
I think we learn a lot about all of our main characters, maybe mostly about Sarah, but we learn a lot about all of our characters and maybe who we as an audience view them as being and who they view themselves as being. And again, we kind of deal with what I talked about at the beginning, which is that this question wants us to ask the question, who are these people? And kind of the also the science fiction spin on the question, who am I? What is a human?
I think that this episode, especially going through it with you, I've really come to appreciate just how much work it does in setting up all the things for these characters and all the little pieces of world building and storytelling that it puts in place for us or reinforces for us. It's really well constructed.
We talked a little bit about exposition and how exposition is done in the pilot episode. This episode provides us with a lot of new information in a way that's pretty sort of seamless and smooth and not crunchy.
Yeah, you
So
don't
it
have
is
a scene where
it
Ellison
is
walks
it is
in and
masterful in
reads a
that
folder
sense.
to you.
Yes. But there was
I
a
really
dearth of
appreciate
Ellison.
it.
There was
Sorry,
a
say it
dearth
again.
of Ellison. We need more Ellison. We need more Charlie.
And we will get them.
The two most sane characters in the show.
Unfortunately, the world of Terminator is not for the sane. The world of Terminator is a world of madness and death, of glory and blood.
I know she says that. Sarah Connor says in her closing monologue, she says that. So maybe we would end with talking about that. She says, "Time is a lie, and the world is a lie." It was like bold statements, Sarah Connor.
I think that's building off of her monologue in Terminator 2, where she says, "Everyone around me is dead. They just don't know it."
Yeah. You wanted to know if we have different thoughts about Ellison based on the fact that he sort of becomes informed by Enrique. First of all, Enrique did not call Ellison. He called an FBI tip line. Or at least I think that's what we're led to believe based on that scene.
Oh, I thought he directly called Ellison, implying that Ellison was his handler.
Oh, you're thinking if that's the case, then that's poor writing on the writer's part, actually, because that's not clear. You're thinking that in the course of Ellison's investigation of Sarah Connor, he tracked Enrique down?
Yeah.
Okay.
And cultivate him as a CI.
If that is the case, then the writer should have made that more clear. Because I did not get that impression from that scene.
Okay.
No, I mean, Ellison, again, it's this contrast, the world is a lie. It's this contrast between the Connors perspective on the world and the normie perspective on the world. Ellison is just doing his job as a law enforcement person. From his perspective, Sarah and John are bank robbing terrorists.
They are, and they're murderers too, because he still thinks she killed
Miles Dyson.
What's his name? Dyson.
Yes, we will return to the Dyson plot in the next episode, I think.
Although not as deeply as the show wanted to, ultimately.
I think it's a great episode. I think this is a good show. Any final thoughts, Ian?
Yeah, this is, as I said, going through it with you, I've really gained more appreciation for how well constructed it is, how it works emotionally. Sarah's struggles, she really is the heart of this first season, and I think she does a great job. Lena Headey does a great job of portraying someone who knows who she has to become and knows who she has to be for her son, but the cost is so high to herself and to everyone around her, and that is powerful, and I really like it.
It is powerful. Yeah, I think it is powerful. Lena Headey tends to get quieter when she's being emotional, whereas Linda Hamilton gets shouty. So there's a slight contrast in performances there. No, I think for me the most emotional scene in this episode was the scene with John and Charlie. But there's also there's just the you talked about the bleakness of this series, just the look of halfway despair in Sarah's eyes as she's getting pre-screened at the hospital for getting a CAT scan, which is not one of Cameron's capabilities. Cameron cannot give you a CAT scan.
All right. Well, that wraps up.
It's a bleakness and humor, Ian. There was bleakness and humor in this episode. I know you're more of a fan of the bleakness than the humor, but there was bleakness and humor in this episode.
I mean, I am a fan of the ability to have a well-polished TV dialogue joke, even if I don't necessarily find it super funny.
Just a little well-crafted joke.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up episode 2 of Sarah Connor Chronicles, and that wraps up Come With Me If You Want to Live, episode 2. And until next time, we'll be back.
We'll be back.